And we, as you just saw, are being recorded. It will be available on YouTube after, and it's also streaming live on Facebook. So we'll get started in just 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you. See, we still have some people joining, so let's just give it 1 more minute before we get started. Okay. Well, hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I am Dr. Yara. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida in the School of Global Health Management and Informatics. And I'm also a co-director of the Palestine Program for Health and Human Rights. So welcome to today's webinar, Blockade, Bombings, and Continuing Trauma, Assessing Mental Health in Gaza. Today is August 2nd, 2023. So some housekeeping before we begin, and as people continue to file in. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion format between the panelists and myself. We will end around 12:15 Eastern Time. It is, as I noted, being recorded and also live streamed on Facebook. So if you're joining us live on Facebook, we can't see you, but welcome as well. We are eager, of course, to take audience questions, and I will attempt to weave them into my own questions for the panel. So please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and you can do so at any time throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions coming in, and I will do my best to incorporate them as they fit organically into the conversation, and if we have time for formal Q&A at the end. Please keep an eye on the chat box as the panelists are speaking. My colleagues at FMEP will be putting useful links and information in the box throughout the discussion, and our panelists have a lot of amazing work that I think you'd be interested in seeing, so definitely keep an eye on that. We will also share those via follow-up email. And finally, please note that we have enabled the closed captioning function via Zoom, so you can read the discussion and follow along if you'd like. So more than 15 years into Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip, and after multiple rounds of devastating Israeli bombing campaigns, as well as the violence seen during the Great March of Return, life in Gaza continues to become more difficult and, of course, traumatic for the 2 million Palestinians who live there. Half of Gaza's population are children, which makes the collective punishment enacted on the small territory particularly egregious. And compounding the injustice is the ongoing silence of the international community, which often speaks the language of human rights, while only hesitantly acknowledging the trauma endured in Gaza only during active bombing campaigns, without any significant international effort to hold Israel accountable for its destruction and deprivation of the territory, both with airstrikes and other forms of military violence, but of course by the siege itself. So what is it like to live under such conditions with no end or reprieve in sight? And today I feel very fortunate to host a conversation among experts about the current state of mental health in the Gaza Strip and what it might mean for the future of Gaza's residents. Among other things, we will look at the findings from a recent mixed method study conducted over 2 years by Physicians for Human Rights Israel and the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. So I am delighted to be joined by my guests, Dr. Yasser Abu-Jamei, Ghada Majadli, and Razzan. And I want to give short introductions to each now, and of course, fuller bios of all of them are available on the FMEP website. Dr. Yasser Abu-Jamei is a psychiatrist and the Director General of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. He was born in 1974 in Saudi Arabia and has received degrees in the mental health field from universities in the UK, Germany, Lithuania, and Gaza. He has lived in Gaza since 2000 and has been working at the Gaza Community Mental Health Program since 2004, becoming its director in 2014. His research has focused on the impact of ongoing violence and the 15-year blockade of Gaza on the physical and psychological health of children and their caregivers, and the connection between public health and human rights. Welcome. Ghada Majadli is a researcher, human rights activist, and the director of the Department of the Occupied Palestinian Territory at Physicians for Human Rights, Israel. She holds a master's degree in human rights and transitional justice from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Her work focuses on policy and humanitarian work in Palestine, with particular attention to the Israeli regime's multi-layered system of control and management of Palestinians' health, including access to medical care, socio-political determinants of health, and health infrastructure. Welcome, Ghada. And lastly, we have Razzan, a Palestinian organizer, psychologist, and facilitator. Razzan is currently a doctoral candidate at George Washington University and a pre-doctoral intern at Boston Medical Center. And she's a co-founding member of the Psychoanalysis in the Arab World Lab at George Washington University. Welcome. Thanks for joining. So to get started into the conversation, I'd like to start first with Dr. Yasser, and I'd like to start from the very beginning. This is a conversation about mental health. So let's make sure we're on the same page about what exactly it is we're talking about. So can you, from your extensive experience doing this work in the Gaza Strip, what do we mean by mental health in the Gazan context?
Thank you very much, Yara. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning for people in the States. It's really an honor to join you today. Well, let me begin by reminding everyone of what I really like, the definition that I like, which is the definition of mental health that the WHO uses. It says it's a state of mental health well-being that first enables people to cope with the stresses of life. Second, realize their abilities. Third, learn well and work well. And then fourth, contribute to their community. I all the time recall these four, let me say, pillars or components of mental health when talking about Gaza Strip. And that's because it's really challenging to apply that definition or to have it strictly applied to the conditions in Gaza Strip for many reasons. First, let's begin with the title of this event. The title says it all. It says blockade, bombings, and continuous trauma. Let's talk about these three components. And this is a little bit ironic, but we are under blockade for now more than 15 years. And to many people who were trying to come and leave Gaza Strip in the last 15 years, they were, imagining what does the blockade mean? What does it entail? However, with the COVID-19 that continues to span the globe for 2 years, a lot of people started to tell us now we understand what does it mean to live under blockade, and that's simply because, one, they experience what does the blockade mean, because it was under the title of social distancing, which meant two things. First, that we are really away from our beloved ones, one, and second, difficult economic conditions or worsening economic conditions. And those two, let me say, issues have meant a lot to the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip over the last many years. Blockade is a restriction of movement. That's the very minimal understanding of it. It yielded a lot of economic problems. And I'll give a couple of figures, that I all the time like to bring up, which is the level of employment and the level of poverty. Unemployment rate is about 45% now in Gaza. It's good. It was 53% a couple of years ago during the pandemic. So now it improved to 45%. But if you look to people below the age of 30, unemployment goes up to as much as 74%. Among the graduates, by the way, but it's in general about 60%. When it comes to poverty, more than half of the population are under poverty rate. So if you speak about the mental health that is under continuous, we could apply the words of Sarah Roy, under continuous economic de-development. And we add to that the catastrophic attacks on Gaza that happens every now and then, 3 times in the last 3 years. Then you can imagine the level of stresses that people are exposed to. That's the first issue. And then the ability to learn and to work. It's very connected, you know, how can we assist the ability of people to work when more than half of the population are underemployment? You know, they are not even capable of being productive. When we speak about 74% of people below the age of 30 who have finished faculty or university degree, they are not able to work. When we speak about, for example, 65% of graduates of engineering faculties below the age of 30 are not employed. So what kind of ability to feel that you are really are capable of learning well and working well? And finally, contribute to your community, you know. Whether as parents, can you help your children? Big question. As parents, can you protect your children? Another question. As parents, can you economically finance your children's studies, for example? This is another question. Are you capable of just moving on with your life? It's another big difficulty question. And then finally, and to give to the floor to my colleagues, then comes the question, well, these continuous attacks that happen in Gaza Strip, do they traumatize people? Do they make people more resilient, you know? And sometimes this, you know, double message, whether those people in Gaza Strip or in Palestine, by the way, at large, are more resilient because they can go on with their lives, or it's just because there is no escape and there is no other way but to struggle and to continue to live up. So these are some questions that hopefully we'll be able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you for that multifaceted look at mental health. And I think what sticks out to me from that is just so much uncertainty and such lack of control over your ability to parent, to work, to finish your education. And of course, the connections with mental health there are, I think, obvious. To follow up on that explanation, Ghada, I'd like to turn to you. Physicians for Human Rights Israel works throughout historic Palestine. And we're going to spend this hour together focused primarily on mental health in Gaza, drawing from this study that PHRI and the Gaza Community Mental Health Program just completed on this topic. Before we do that, from your perspective, from PHRI, I want to ask you to talk to us a bit about how you understand the concept of mental health and how it can be understood in relationship to Palestinians throughout historic Palestine.
Yeah. Thank you, Yara, and good afternoon, good evening for everyone. I'm also honored to be here today and to join other colleagues in this conversation. So in our view, the mental health discourse cannot be divorced from the political and the historical context in which, since the Nakba, Palestinians have lived in an inherently violent and eliminatory reality of settler colonialism and also occupation. In the Nakba of the 48, the social fabric of the Palestinian people was dismantled. Palestinians were doomed to live in a fragmented as a fragmented people in spaces and also into classes with different legal and political statuses, where also Palestinians, including in the diaspora, lived in isolation from their geographical, cultural, and national continuation, and they were robbed of their cultural heritage. This understanding is very important for us, not only in how we view the health in general, but also the mental health of Palestinians. And since the Nakba was a traumatic and a foundational event that has never been recognized and is still ongoing, we talk about mental health when there is no real space for healing. And in addition, for the trauma experienced by the first generation of the Nakba and the military rule that Palestinians in 48 were subjected to, they also suffer from structural and intentional violence, discrimination, and racism. Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip are subject to military occupation and the blockade. And all of this is part of a settler colonial ideology and practice in which we believe that health and mental health must be contextualized. Second, we view Palestinian mental health as one that impacted by social and political determinants of health. In the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, the mental health of Palestinians is impacted, for example, by violence, whether repeated military attacks on the Gaza Strip, as we will see also in the findings that we will present, or home invasions by the Israeli army and settlers on Palestinian homes in the West Bank, which also tremendously affect the health of Palestinians, including children. Also, mental health is impacted by the physical health and vice versa, both in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and for Palestinians living in the in 48 or in Israel. And the mental health of Palestinians is impacted also by the structural discrimination concerning, for example, health allocations, health infrastructure, the green spaces, and budget for education, and more. So if we talk about disparities between Palestinians and Israelis, whether inside of Israel or in the occupied territories, these also impact the mental health of Palestinians and include other mental health conditions.
Thank you, Ghada. I think that's such an important answer, and I think it helps scholars and those interested in mental health in Palestine recognize that, you know, mental health outcomes, it's not just a humanitarian or medical issue to be dealt with through treatment or intervention, but it really requires acknowledging all of these historical and political and social factors. And I think, you know, more of the work done really needs to acknowledge that. So thank you for that. Razzan, I'd like to turn to you next. You are joining us today as both a mental health practitioner and also a scholar. And I want to ask you about one specific element of mental health scholarship, and that kind of builds off of that point. Measuring mental health outcomes is so important. But if the data is stripped of context, of social determinants, of history, like Ghada so neatly pointed out, then it loses its meaning in terms of what actual solutions and interventions look like. Measuring and describing mental health trauma in such a context of ongoing violation and injustice, sometimes, if you're just looking at the biomedical model, places the abnormality within the individual and not in what it's like to live in an abnormal environment. I think to be depressed and anxious and have trauma living in such an environment is not abnormal. It's completely a normal response. But as public health professionals, we also need to be able to document, mental health struggles and present that data in international contexts, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, or being able to present comparative work, or even just to describe to people less familiar with the context. So can you talk about this tension between recognizing the limitations of measuring mental health in an environment like the Gaza Strip, along with why it's so important for us as mental health practitioners and scholars to actually do so?
Yes, thank you for the question, Yara, and masal khair for everyone joining Sharq al-Awsat. Good morning for those on the West Coast, and good afternoon on the East Coast. Yes, that's definitely a tension. And I think that it's important to do what you just did. So you're modeling for us, Yara, an importance here, which is speaking to the tension What you're doing by speaking to it is you're exposing the ideology behind it. What you just described is a very like neoliberal approach, which pathologizes the individual and eliminates or obscures the context, the situation, the structural and systematic. So I always think that even in very quantitative research methodologies, you know, to mention that, to name that as one of the limitations to the research, in addition to kind of bringing light to it. I also think that if I look at it in a way, many of the psychological assessment tools we have today have been normed on populations predominantly in the West, predominantly in economically privileged scenarios and situations. And so even here, as I study in the United States, when I'm doing neuropsychological assessments, I have to consider when I'm administering something like the MMPI, it's like a multiphasic personality inventory, or something even as the WAIS, like it's an intelligence assessment to know if someone has a learning disability and what kind of accommodations for the individualized education plan in the US context. I always have to look at, you know, what are the identities this person holds and what are the contexts they're emanating from, so that I understand, is their processing speed showing me an issue with, like, you know, attention deficit disorder, or is it showing me both like a reality of not having breakfast in the morning, not having stable housing, disrupted, you know, caregiving situations. And so I think when we look at Palestine and Gaza in specific, it is very important to have those measures because it allows us to kind of have a discussion globally and internationally. And at the same time, it gives us a lens into Palestinian reality. I feel that often the Palestinian subjectivity is one that's flattened and we don't look at the multidimensionality. So there's also this other wave to just go fully into looking at the structural and systematic that forgoes that people also have their idiosyncrasies and differences. And so rather than us be like pulled from one pole to the other, to kind of maybe more so approach it like a dance where you take a step forward, take a step back, and together it gives this beautiful rhythmic movement and really sheds light on the multiplicity of who a Palestinian is. Even amongst us, Ghada, Yasser, and myself were raised in very different parts of historic Palestine. We have similarities and we also have these differences, and not to feel like we need to flatten it. I also think that it's really important to recognize with these measures, what are the preconditions establishing the symptoms? If we go directly to address the symptom, then you can very much eliminate a symptom, right? So if someone's like, I'm suffering of sleeplessness, you might prescribe a medication, you might do a few like, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy, and ACT has a lot of like, how do you address this in like 12 or 9 sessions? But if we don't look at what is the root or precondition of that, another symptom is going to emerge in its place. And so it is also important to look at it in that way. It makes it more complex, but you know, human beings are complex. And I think that's something that is both exciting for us to lean into. And there's so much left to learn. Did that answer it, Yara?
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes just acknowledging that tension exists and recognizing that some works are focused on looking at outcomes and some works are focused at looking at determinants. And I think also hearing from your perspective as a practitioner, looking at any patient, you know, you have to consider their personal and their intergenerational story and history. And I think, you know, as we apply it to broader populations like the Palestinians, that's very valuable insight. So thank you for bringing that, especially ahead of my next question, which is specifically about a study that is looking at health outcomes. This is what we'll spend our next few minutes talking about. So Ghada, I'm coming to you from your position at PHRI. Can you kind of start us off with telling us about, this was a 2-year study looking at mental health in Gaza. Obviously, a lot has happened in the Gaza Strip over the past 2 years. So can you tell us just the logistics of the study? Who designed it? What were the goals? What did it aim to find out? How was it conducted? I noted earlier that it was a mixed method study. And could you give us some of your top line main findings?
Yeah, thank you, Yara, for the question. The research was one of the components of a larger joint project between PHRI and the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. which was funded by the EU and included several aspects, such as training and conferences for mental health practitioners in the Gaza Strip, joint mobile clinics, local and international advocacy, and also public outreach around the state of mental health and the impact of the blockade and Israeli human rights violation on the physical and mental health of Gazan women. It was a 3-year project, started maybe in 2020, if I recall, and it was paused because of the COVID-19, and then we continued the project in 2021, which also the project included 2 years of research. We had a joint steering committee from both organizations that designed the research. It consisted of experts and researchers from various fields such as mental health, medical anthropology, gender, and sociology. The study addresses the link between Israeli human rights violations, which includes also the blockade, the Great March Return assaults, and repeated military attacks on the Gaza Strip, and Palestinians' mental health, specifically adult women in the Gaza Strip. It also investigated the extent to which adult women were exposed to the Israeli human rights violations in the Gaza Strip and their effect on their physical and mental health. These violations were also contextualized as part of an inherently violent reality of the ongoing blockade, the occupation, and as I said, the repeated military assaults on the Gaza Strip. We used as you said, Yara, mixed methods study of the impact of human rights violation on women in Gaza, including also a survey developed by mental health professionals from the Gaza Community Mental Health Program and from PHRI. The survey was answered by 424 women, adult women, who also attended the Gaza Community Mental Health Program community centers and PHRI's mobile clinics in Gaza. The survey was also followed by 19 in-depth interviews conducted with women who had scored highly for depression and anxiety in the survey. So just to give you like an idea about the participants, the participants were women aged 24 to 45 years. Over half of the participants also lived in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. More than 90% were also unemployed and lived below the poverty line in Gaza. So as for the findings, I'm gonna address and present only few of the findings. We will be sending you also a 2-pagers with more information and more details, also quotation. I can start by saying that the findings showed a clear link between the exposure to human rights violations and also the accompanying traumatic experience with these violations and the mental health conditions. So to give you a couple of rates, 64.9% of the women showed signs of psychological distress. 47.6% of these women demonstrated severe psychological distress, and 80.9% of the women suffered from severe anxiety. As well, women also reported emotional distress in light of the repeated military attacks and the bombings, where they fear death. They fear also repeated bombings and attacks in the future as well. They fear the losing of family members and losing their homes. Actually, fear was one of the most prevalent when we talk about the emotional distress demonstrated by the women who were interviewed for the in-depth interviews. For many of these women, this fear was actually a result of witnessing distressing scenes, including the death of their family members and of their neighbors. These women also described the intense fear of the intense fear experienced by their own children during the Israeli attacks, which also affected them and affected their emotional distress and resulted in a fear experienced by these women. I quote one of the women in one of the interviews who said that fear is all I feel. I fear waking up to the news of death of X and Y. Hopelessness was also one of the emotional conditions that was reported by these women, and it was a result of the ongoing exposure to the trauma, and it was demonstrated by expressing a loss of hope for a secure life in Gaza, the stability, the ability to plan for the future as well, or even any chance of having an improvement in their economic and political conditions in Gaza. So in one of the interviews, one of the women said that I don't think we are going to survive in the next war. And we have other quotation that you can see also in the 2 pages. So I'm not sure how much time I also have, but I'm going to also say something about other findings where the findings revealed a grave violation of women's right to life and also to their health. The most noticeable was the threat to their life and the lives of their family members. 35.6% of these women lost one of their family members for the Israeli military assaults. 35.7% lost a family member after they didn't receive a medical exit permit from the Israeli authorities. Almost all women experienced the attacks by the Israeli military, and some of them actually experienced more than one Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. As to the right to health, more than 30% of the women who attended the Gaza Community Mental Health Centers and also our mobile clinics were injured during the attacks on the Gaza Strip. 65% of them who participated also in the Great March returned suffered from injuries. And one of the most striking data is that 70% were also unable to access essential medical treatment and life-saving treatment due to the restrictions enabled by the Israeli perpetrators.
Wow, thank you for sharing those initial findings. It's, the levels of fear and hopelessness that you document, in some ways not surprising, yet somehow shocking at the same time. And I want to reiterate that some of these main findings we just shared in the chat, and we will follow up via email. And also, it's just striking to me that it's on both ends. It's the increased risk of violence to oneself or to a loved one, and then the inability to receive and access the care that they may need to deal with the results of that violence and deprivation. So yeah, quite stark findings. Thank you, Ghada. Dr. Yasser, I'd like to turn to you next. As Ghada noted, this study is mostly focused on women and women's experiences. So can you tell us about the ways in which in your experience, you've seen women experience mental health struggles in Gaza? What is particularly gendered about these experiences? We know that in Gaza, civilian spaces are vulnerable, completely vulnerable to bombardments. You know, the Israeli Air Force bombs apartment buildings, homes. We've seen schools and hospitals and, you know, children playing outside, getting bombed. There isn't really a battlefield that is outside of the home. So during these bombardments, there is really no feeling of safety. At the same time, like in many contexts around the world, women are primarily responsible for the home and for the family and the needs of the children. And under conditions of siege, it is exceptionally hard for these basic needs to be met, you know, bombardment aside. So can you talk to us about the specifics of trauma and mental health factors and challenges as women in Gaza facing these multiple fronts of violence and oppression and deprivation, how they face them?
But I can begin with some few examples. You know, let me talk about the displaced people. You know, for example, in May 2021, more than 100,000 people were destroyed from their homes. You know, and this was not the biggest number of displaced people. In 2014, more than 500,000 people were displaced from their houses. We speak about then about 1/4 of the population. They were displaced from their homes. At the end of the attacks in 2014, more than 100,000 people didn't find a place to return to because their houses were either completely destroyed or not inhabitable anymore. In 2021, the number is lesser because people who were fleeing from the bordering sites, you know, the very eastern sides of Gaza Strip, didn't really find it meaningful to go to the western side. As you said, we don't have shelters here in Gaza Strip. It's a small, tiny geographical area, which is about 8 to 12 miles in width and about 24 miles in length. So you can imagine if the bombardment comes from the air, you know, it comes from the eastern side, artillery, it comes from everywhere, where people can seek a hide away. You know, we don't have really shelters in Gaza. The only places that people were running to is at UNRWA school. You know, in 2014, on average, there were about, I think, more than 110,000 people who were crowding 50 UNRWA schools. You know, these were the shelters. On average, there were 2,000 people in school. Now, let's imagine how women had to deal with the very basic needs of their kids under these circumstances. You know, when an attack is happening and a lot of children, a lot of women are stuck in the same place with women who would really sleep on the streets or go to sleep in the mosques, you know, during those times. And then when the time is over, when the attacks is over, how women were really managing their daily issues. Daily issues, I mean, just, you know, washing the clothes, preparing food, taking care of the kids, you know, just looking after their family, like just, you know, even it's an issue whether you can give your child a hug or not, you know, because again, it takes a lot of efforts when you are under attack. You don't have anything in mind that you can offer really to calm or to soothe them. They fear, the anxiety, the stresses of the kids. You know, when you hear the loud bombardments, what can you say? What can you tell your children? And you know that you cannot really lie to them. You cannot give them a false, let me say, statement that will undermine your rule, you know, that will make you look like a liar, you know, that will make them lose their trust in you. And that's not something that happened only like during the attacks, you know, those difficult conditions or stresses that are on the shoulders of mainly women. The blockade also meant a lot. In the very beginning years of blockade, imagine that, you know, We had a problem with finding clothing for children, for example. Shoes for children were not available in the markets for the very first couple of years when the blockade started. Now it's limited to many other issues, but I mean, we had so much difficulty in just going on with our lives. For a joke, not a single woman was really capable of showing a complete set of glasses, for example, when they had guests or so, because even glasses were not allowed to come into Gaza. That's in 2008, 2009 or so. And then for the daily living conditions, I mean, more than half of the population live under poverty rate. 1/3 of the population live under severe poverty rate. We have half of the population in Gaza Strip are children. So imagine that half of the women in Gaza Strip have to deal with severe economic conditions, with poverty, and at the same time to try to help their children. And we add to that we have a problem of power supply. We have to add to that we have a problem with potable water. 95, I think now 97% of the water in Gaza is not potable. It's not good for drinking. And I always say, let's look at the daily life of women in Gaza Strip. That's any woman. On average, we have about 5 kids per family. And because we have overcrowded schools, the schools have to operate in 2 shifts, 1 morning shift and 1 afternoon shift. So on average, 2 kids or 3 will go to the morning shift and the other 2 or 3 will go to the afternoon shift. That's between 6:30 a.m. They will leave home, the first shift, and then we'll come back by about 11:30, 11:40. The second group will leave the house at 11:30 and will come back at about maybe 4:30 or 5 p.m. And then the mother has to take care of the whole process, which means wake up early morning, 6 at the latest, usually 5:30. She would wake up the children, try to help them with breakfast, try to provide them with the available clothing, and prepare them to go to schools. That's by 6:37. That's the morning, the very early morning task. A couple of hours later, she has to deal with the afternoon shift kids. They will go to school. A couple of hours later, within the hour, the morning shift kids will be back from schools. A few hours later, the afternoon shift will be back from schools. And then within those hours, between 6 a.m. and 5 p.m., she has also to deal with the washing, with the clothing. This is in Gaza Strip, it's more of a male-dominated society, which means that a lot of taking care of the issues at home are on the shoulders of women. And this is really extremely heavy issue to deal with. Now, let's keep in mind one example. Nowadays, because of the heat conditions, we have, on average, we have power supply for 6 hours, and then it's off for 10 hours, something like that. It should be 8 and 8. That's the best, we hope, 8 hours on and 8 hours off. Let's talk about 8 hours on and 8 hours off. And then we have the golden moments, if you could say. I like to call them the golden times. 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m. And that's where the power supply gets off or gets on. So imagine that the kids are coming back from school and it's a muddy day, And as I said, half of the population live under poverty rate. I think they will have only 1 set of clothing, of school clothing per child. Imagine that the clothes are dirty. What would the mother do? Will wash the clothes because they have to be prepared for tomorrow morning. But what if the power supply is not there? And this struggle is not something that happens only once a month. It's part of the daily struggle of women. That's their lives. And let's come back to the definition that I already mentioned about mental health. Women are lovely creatures. Like everyone else, they have the right to have some leisure time. And please tell me, where is that leisure time that a mother would have in Gaza Strip? That's one question. Another question, do they have time of, let me say, peace, complete safety or security, that they will be able to restore their, let me say, a reservoir of coping mechanisms, That's another big question, When we have the drones that are filling the skies day and night, we don't have now any attacks on Gaza for the last few months, but then the question is, when we keep in our mind that the most frequent event that was reported by the interviewees was that 98.8% of them were hearing the loud noises of the drones, and those drones continue to be there 24/7. So the life itself is a very difficult one. Supporting figures are not, I think their husbands, it's a male-dominated society, but again, they are the main breadwinners, which means that they are under tremendous pressure. When you have 45% unemployment, well, you know how you are going to continue to survive, to live. So it's a harsh environment, and women have and already endured bravely with these conditions. And I would say why? Because all the children who are at school age, they continue to go to schools, they continue to achieve. We continue to have tens of thousands of people who join university every year. We have tens of thousands who graduate from universities every year. This is something to be proud of. We have the highest level of education, maybe in the Middle East. But again, unfortunately, unemployment rates are extremely high, especially when it comes to people below the age of 30, especially when it comes to women below the age of 30.
Thank you. I think that offers two important reminders, which is that even living under such conditions, regular life does not stop. So especially for caregivers and families. And so we're constantly, I think, hearing about, the after effects of bombing and things like that. But I think it's underappreciated that, people are still trying to send their children to school, and the compounding stressors of that, of trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, especially for children, is magnified by their inability to do so due to all these external factors. And I think it's also important to note here that when you layer the gender norms, the gender expectations of women in these kinds of societies, and that they do take on the bulk of the household work, which is, again, complicated by all these external factors, it really exacerbates, I think, the stressors of women in these environments who, like you say, probably have zero time to actually process and wrestle with their own needs and their own mental health struggles. And I think that's really powerful aspect of this study. Ghada, earlier you noted that 35% of respondents who reported high levels of depression and anxiety in your study had lost a family member after not receiving a medical permit from the Israelis. So you and I have talked a lot about this issue. This is an issue of particular interest to me in my work, and yet I think is an issue that is particularly unexplored and not understood in outside of public health circles, even those specifically dealing with Palestine. So can you briefly tell us a little bit about this permit system and how it works? Where are these patients trying to go? Why do they have to apply for a permit? And a little bit about, because I know PHR, a lot of your work is in advocating for permits and helping overturn permit denials. So can you tell us a little also about the likelihood of receiving a permit and what it's, the stresses of trying to apply for these permits, especially because you're applying for an Israeli permit. So you're applying for a permit from the same regime that imposes the siege and deprivation that causes them to need to leave to get healthcare to begin with. So again, I know this is a topic we could have an entire conversation about, but can you tell us and kind of explain to our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Yara, for the question. I'm just gonna, I'm not sure if it's to start from the end, but to add to what you said, it's funny that Israel created the problem in the first place of a healthcare system that has been challenged. And also, it is good also to mention that succeeded despite the conditions to meet the needs of the population. And then when they are required or when they when patients need a medical permit outside of Gaza, for example, then they need to apply for the same system that created the problem in the first place. So I'm not sure where to start, but I'm going to assume that the listeners and the audience know that Israel controls the movement between the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, because they also control the checkpoints, whether the Erez checkpoints or other checkpoints in the West Bank and between the West Bank and Jerusalem. So since Israel controls the movement between different Palestinian areas, then it also controls, this control also includes control over the movement of patients. So the situation today is like this. There's shortage in medical supplies, shortage in expertise, shortage in medications, especially in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. And in short, I will say that it is mainly because of the Israeli control over and the blockade over the Palestinian territory. So for example, Israel controls the imports and the exports. During the COVID-19, if the Palestinian Authority wanted to import a specific sort of type of vaccination, it was the Israeli Health Ministry had to approve this vaccination so it can be delivered to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip. So these restrictions apply also for patients. All the patients from the Gaza Strip and from the West Bank, if they want to access medical treatment which is unavailable in their place of residence, they have to go through a very bureaucratic process of applying for the permit regime. First, they need there's a committee within the Palestinian Health Ministry that examine the referral. They also provide the financial coverage, and then patients can apply for the Israeli permit through the civil administration, the Palestinian civil administration in the Gaza Strip. It's a very long and tedious process where patients are required to apply 23 days before their appointment in hospitals. And there's also another route for life-saving treatments. More than 80% of Palestinian patients, whether from the Gaza Strip or from the West Bank, are referred to Palestinian hospitals, whether governmental or private hospitals, and they are all part of the Palestinian healthcare system, and yet they have to apply for the Israeli permit, which is absurd. So if you are a cancer patient, for example, and your chemotherapy treatment isn't available in Gaza, almost 40% of medications for chemotherapy treatments are not available in Gaza, radiotherapy treatment isn't available at all in the Gaza Strip, then you have to apply for a permit every time you have a treatment in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. The rates for 2019 until 2022 were higher than recent years, but it's still, I think the rate was 65%, only 65% of those who applied for an Israeli permit from the Gaza Strip and from the West Bank were denied the Israeli permit. It can be for security, what Israel calls security reasons. It can be for criteria, as Israel also interfere in medical and health considerations. It can be for other bureaucratic reasons. For example, these are unclear documents. We don't have your phone numbers. And I can say that from our experience and experience of other human rights organizations working to challenge this permit regime, specifically when we're speaking about patients. These decisions made by the Israeli army are very arbitrary, because when we appeal, whether for the COGAT, which is the coordination of government activities in the Palestinian territory, or to Israeli courts, in 50% of these cases, we're able to overturn these decisions. And the second thing that is very important to notice as well is that Israel has been abusing its control over the permit regime, and the very existence of the permit regime in order to control the Palestinian population and exploit their needs of health for exerting political pressure on Hamas's government, and sometimes to gathering intelligence information about the population.
Thank you. And I know that was very complex and technical, but just as a reminder to everyone, you know, when you're in a health situation, it's oftentimes sensitive. And so to consider going through this process for yourself or for your child or for your elderly parent, when you're already feeling the stress and vulnerability of dealing with, you know, someone being diagnosed with cancer or needing brain or heart surgery, you can see how the denial or delay of these permits would absolutely lead to distress and mental health trauma, if it happens in your family. So thank you for that, Ghada. And I think in the chat, we will try to share a position paper from PHRI on receiving a medical permit for those interested. Razzan, I'd like to turn to you next. So, you know, I want to ask you to think with me as we kind of get close to wrapping up here, and with us, about how we approach research on mental health. We kind of broached this a little in the beginning. So as one of the findings in the study, obviously, is we see, you know, high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And this is a common framing used in situations of armed conflict, you know, especially after the Vietnam War. And I, along with many others who have made this similar argument, there's kind of this issue or tension with this term, because of course, Palestinians, especially those in the Gaza Strip, are not post-trauma. The trauma is ongoing. You know, the fear of bombardment or deprivation is not an irrational or remnant fear. It is an ongoing, persistent fear that, you know, is reignited every time there is a round of airstrikes, or every time something is unavailable for medical care or shoes or whatever you need for your household. Yet I use this framing in my work, and everyone who studies mental health in Palestine does so. You know, PTSD is a common understanding, and again, for publishing in international journals, for op-eds, for being able to situate Palestine globally, it is useful. So can you help me understand how you approach using this term and this framing? I'm thinking about how I and other scholars want to use language that is clear and understandable for international audiences, but also doesn't erase the nuance and specificity of the Palestinian experience.
Yes, thank you very much, Yara. I think similar to earlier, you know, it's useful in as much as it is a shared language, like the way that we understand that nomothetically. So in a categorical way, to say PTSD has a certain kind of understanding, conceptualization a person gets, and that's helpful to kind of bring us onto the same table. I encourage and I push us to move, though, in a different direction. So you can come as a starting point and use these measures. You know, I have to do a lot of PTSD measures for a lot of asylum seekers coming into the US just to apply for their asylum to US government. So, you know, we can do that, and that's quite different because there's a post situation. There are many scholars in Palestine, from Lina Ma'ari to Murad Amer, although maybe a lot of the work is done in Arabic, you know, they are really problematizing PTSD, the post in the traumatic stress disorder aspect. And I encourage us, and folks are doing this, you know, the Institute for Community and Public Health at Birzeit University of really creating measures that are specific to our context. Because how PTSD came to be, right? You named Vietnam because that's the most like kind of, but it also started in the European context of journaling of what was happening to soldiers from World War I and World War II, and then returning to other countries. And so in our situation, just like Dr. Yasser mentioned, like Ghada mentions, and you said, there is you're staying in the muck of it. You're in the midst of it. It's actually more pathological, more sickly, more disease-like for you to have a post-response to a chronic situation, right? So, and I think that is something that Ghada, your research touches on. When you were citing one of the signifiers of the hopelessness, what came to my mind was, in that quote, you know, like, okay, I've survived this time. I don't know how much more I can survive. I don't believe I'll survive the future. This hopelessness is very much tied to the capacity to envision and plan, or executive functioning capacity, right? And so this is the insidiousness of the Zionist regime, because what it does is in implanting this idea of hopelessness, there's a almost up titration for our chemist lovers of a death drip, of saying like, there is no opportunity here. This is the psychological operations. This is another form of the warfare. It's saying that this Zionist aggression is not only obliterating all of the spaces you see around you, it's obliterating you. And in that way, how are you then supposed to show up, to even wake up early enough to go get the water when that is a necessity, when, you know, the motors are only working for electricity at a certain time of day, to push through. For more of our Western audience, I'll use a Western psychologist that was quite well known, Donald Winnicott, when he wrote about like transitional phenomenon. I think about that into adulthood, you know, that kind of manifests. It starts as children in the space of play, but we carry it on as adults into our spaces of intellectualizing, philosophizing, creativity, art. And so what is happening with this hopelessness, it's a form of also obliterating, debilitating the capacity to create anew. And despite this, we see in Gaza, there is such a, you know, I don't know if others know this outside of the Palestine context, but we tend to say that the funniest people are like the Ghazazwid, people from Gaza, just have a remarkable sense of humor. It's true, like tragedy breeds that, but there's also a sumud, you know, a kind of importance there as something that perseverance, a steadfastness that pushes through. And recent research is actually more in the behavioral frame, is showing that for you to create a new habit, it takes about 60 to 70 iterations of a behavior. However, if you infuse it with play, it only takes between 5 to 10 iterations. And so let's think complexly about those layers. What happens when we're debilitating the capacity to seek hope, to seek the executive function, to plan and to strategize? We're also limiting, and you need that space to play. Another thing I think about when considering traumatic disorders in Palestine and in Gaza specific, this emotional blunting that you spoke about, Ghada, this is another way where, like, I want to remind, when we have to blunt the pain, we're also blunting the pleasure, right? So very commonly when people are like, oh, I want an antidepressant, I sometimes like fight against that and say, it's an SSRI. It's important because using the label antidepressants make it seem like there's an antidote to the depression. In reality, what it's going to do is it's going to blunt and buffer some of the intensity of those symptoms, which are great, and let's do it. But also understand that the pleasurable aspects and sensations of your life are also going to be blunted. And so this is another level of the dehumanization that folks in Palestine and specifically Gaza are exposed to, of kind of saying to live on, there's an incapacity to live a fullness of being in life. And then the signifier that you all measured for PTSD that usually goes into systematize, like the clinician administered PTSD inventory, which is usually what we use, the rates of like anxiety and irritation. I want to say here that like the intergenerational link is really important. There's a lot of wonderful research being done on epigenetics. And one of the things we see, and I think most of these studies were done in the US context based after the Twin Tower attacks, was that caregivers that gave birth to their children then after, the children had higher rates of ADHD and ADD. And what they realized was that there was an importance because the women were exposed to intense, or the carriers were exposed to intense traumatic effect, the proliferation of those the stress hormones in the body makes it so the child is developing in an evolutionary way to have the capacity to be more on the lookout. I mean, to kind of not be so tunnel vision and capacity to look around is actually going to save your life. And so how it might be read here, so sorry, let me take a step back. What I'm trying to say is, let's consider who this normativity benefits. And what are we looking at when we say this is the normal way to be? Do I want for children coming up in Gaza right now to be plagued with, the struggles of being neurodivergent in a dominantly like capitalist neoliberal world that demands of the subject to be a certain way? Of course not. And will I pathologize that? I will not look at the child and say, you have an issue now, let me give you Ritalin or a certain kind of medication. I'm going to look at, in this situation, the context. So in writing your papers, doing your research, look at that, tie the anxiety, the irritation, the agitation to where it's also emanating from and what outcomes it might have then for gender-based relations in a country, or how you might see other dynamics occurring in a society. There's this really important quote that's from this practitioner, Black African-American practitioner in the US. His name is Resma Menakem. If I can read it to you all, it's very brief, but he teaches us and he says, trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. Trauma decontextualized in peoples looks like culture. What happens over time is that our state becomes trait, becomes identity, becomes culture. And so what I always suggest for researchers, scholars, practitioners is to now take that quote and move it the other way around, backwards. What am I looking at as culture? There were some they landed for me as offensive questions in the chat, trying to categorize a certain way of being as the cause of this. So I would start to walk back. Instead of ask, how does a religion affect this? I say, how has culture come to be from identity? And how has identity come to be from this trait? And how did this trait come to be from the state? And kind of like move through that. And as a last thing, also from a really wonderful abolitionist based on Turtle Island, she teaches us that, hope is a discipline. It's a practice. It's a thing you must return to. And I find that in the irritation and agitation, sometimes in Palestine itself, I might be like, oh my God, can't you take a chill pill? That at the same time, I'm also like, it's so important that we have this insistence and grit and unruliness and defiance and disruption, because that is what you need when you have a constant system and states that are pushing you down to bend that will. And so when you hold on to your will, I think that is better than any medicine, any talk therapy I may provide in an individual, treatment modality, holding on to that. And I believe, and our people have shown us that they have the capacity to imagine new worlds and how to make that possible. Like Razzan, like the people from Gaza having wonderful sense of humor and infusing it. So that's what I would say for that question.
Well, thank you. That was such a rich response. And I think if you could share actually in the chat some of the scholars you mentioned for our listeners and our audience and myself who would like to follow up on that work, I really appreciate it. And I think you're right. I think, we often pathologize and look at the end outcomes, the understandable mental health outcomes of this, but the fact that Palestinians remain and exist as a people and still have held on to their culture and identity despite these multiple systems that have fought against that, from a Palestinian flag to speaking Arabic to, maintaining, foraging our wild foods that we eat, I think speaks highly of this kind of resilience and this holding on that we also, I think, need to acknowledge. So I'd like to, Yasser, I first want to ask you if you have any remarks about this term. I mean, you're a mental health professional, an expert yourself of PTSD. And then I also want to ask you a kind of larger question. Often in these webinars and in papers, people ask, well, what can we do? What can be done? And often the answer is broad, end the siege, end the occupation, decolonize. I want to ask you about the tension between addressing the siege and its impact, and also addressing the immediate needs of the people you serve in your role as a director of a Gaza community mental health program. So how, if you do both, how do you do both? You know, how do you deal with the short term, the patient sitting in front of you, and the long-term understanding that until these conditions end, there will continue to be patients who come to see you? Do you, and in your work as a mental health professional, is advocating against the siege a part of that? And also, is there a particular tension with funders and international partners who want to support or invest in projects for the end goal that are focused on particular outcomes, but tend to take the siege as a given, as something that can't be changed? So like, what is achievable within the context of siege, not how can we work to lift the siege altogether? You know, how do you deal with all of those tensions in your role?
Thank you, Yara. I mean, these, I think, more than 3 questions together. I try to answer as short as or as
it was a lot, absolutely.
Yeah, as possible. I will not go to talk more about the term of PTSD. You know, I think Razzan just put everything in a very nice and wonderful way. But still, that term PTSD is it's the term that is used academically internationally to speak about the impact of trauma. It's definitely not the most appropriate one to talk about the suffering of the Palestinian people. However, it will continue to be there. You know, this is something that we need to keep in our mind. But what's important is to shed the light all the time on the specifications, on the context that the people in Palestine at large live in. You know, it's an ongoing, traumatizing, re-traumatizing, transgenerationals, full with different types of human rights violations that impact the people either individually or collectively. So with that, a lot of things happen. And we try our best when we write, whether articles, scientific articles, or in general journals, to just shed light on what is life really in Gaza. Because, you know, after all, we are all humans. You know, it's very important to understand what's really happening. And sometimes those figures are, unfortunately, you know, they are just figures. You know, each single person suffering is really important to be addressed, to be looked into. You know, that's why in GCMHP, since we were established in 1990 by the late Yasser, who was not only a brilliant psychiatrist, but also a human rights advocate, you know, a human rights defender. The idea was that most of the suffering of the people in Palestine comes from human rights violations, you know, violations to the rights that should be enforced, if I could say, by the international laws. You know, we have different laws that are adapted internationally by UN organizations that apply. Most of them apply to the conditions in Palestine. We are mental health professionals. We work in the Gaza community mental health program. We have 3 community centers. What we immediately deal with, for example, and see with time, we continue to speak about 2 things that we observe. So we observe, one is relapse. You know, relapse happen a lot often, you know, especially when it comes to, for example, families who live in neighborhoods that near the separation fence, you know, for example, because these are almost frequently exposed to the attacks. You know, they are at the most difficult areas, and some of the houses were destroyed more than 2 times, even before, in 2 different occasions. But people don't have any other place to go to, and they shouldn't really go to another place to live in, because these are their own living places, their own living land. So in many of the cases, you know, there is no big, large-scale operation, but a bombardment would happen and here or there, and then the loud explosive sound will cause a lot of children, for example, to relapse. And then the implications is that maybe bedwetting is back, maybe night terrors or night mirrors are back, sleeping difficulties, or clear PTSD, if we could say, symptoms. So one of the things is the relapse. The other thing is that it's really more difficult to help people go over their difficulties. You know, it's more difficult to help people be treated, if we could say, you know, treated of the difficulties they face, treated of when they have a diagnosis that they have. Because we also have a multidisciplinary team, composed of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and nurses. And we look at the people with a diagnosis, that is either related to the traumatizing events or related to the, let me say, to the ongoing economic conditions. The main two diagnoses that we have at our community centers are depression. Almost 40% of women who come to our community centers have depression, 35% of men. And then the second one is trauma-related anxiety, fear, such kind of various disorders. And these are like 35% of men, about 30% of women. And then the remaining is different various conditions. For children, the main diagnosis that come is PTSD, bedwetting, and sleep difficulties, sleep problems. So it's really becoming more and more difficult to help people go out of the, for example, depression they have. We used sometimes to use cognitive therapy, sometimes cognitive behavioral or psychotherapy, sometimes medication, sometimes both. But it's getting more into both because it's getting more difficult to help people get over things when they reach the level of having a diagnosis. At the same time, there is a huge level of despair, this is very strange, when you see people continue to struggle with their daily life and continue to try to support their families, to support their children, try to think about the future, invest in their children, academic performance, for example, and at the same time face issues with despair, like the continuous difficult socioeconomic conditions, losing a job, for example, getting a very small wage that is not enough just to go on with your daily needs. And these continue to be there. How can you help? Well, outside of our clinical work, we try, for example, to educate the society at large, because education is very important. Health, mental health is also part of health. It's all the time important to help people, cope, increase their coping mechanisms, styles, enable them or help them to address the difficulties that are, or the symptoms that are caused by the current conditions when their children start to show symptoms of trauma, symptoms of anxiety, and that's something important. And internationally, what we try to do is that we bring the Palestinian experience to the international community, because again, I think the international community has an obligation to try to support the Palestinian people, to work on supporting the Palestinian people, because justice is a global phenomenon. It's not related to a specific race or a specific nature of people or specific color. We are all alike, and we need to think of all lives, all populations, Palestinians as well as Ukrainians, for example. We are the same, yeah? We are the same, Palestine and the Ukraine, it's the same. The same struggle, the same conditions. We deserve to be looked after, like the other areas in the world, and above all, in the terms of humanity, So we try to bring that to the surface. The project, the research component of the project with Physicians for Human Rights was to look into that, to think what can be done. Actually, this event, thanks to the organizers, is also part of our advocacy that please people look at what happens when the human rights are not respected. What can we all collectively do together? A lot of the things are at the political level, but again, we are mental health advocates, we are human rights defenders, we try our best, and we just try our best to shed the light here and there when there is a chance to do that. But a lot of the work is on the shoulders of this international organizational community that put by itself rules that we all need to follow without any exception.
Thank you. Well, I hope that they're listening. I know we've gone a few minutes over, and I appreciate everyone's patience. But for the very last question, Ghada, I will end with you. It's a similar question. From your positionality as someone working in an organization that's tasked with advocacy, what are steps that can be taken to ease the burden of women like those in the study and of others in Gaza today, while recognizing that ultimately what we need is radical structural change? So how do we do both? And do you address both in your work in PHRI?
Yeah, thank you, Yara, for the question. I think that the tension between addressing the root causes of the humanitarian situation, the mental health situation, and advocating for individuals, whether it's for the obtaining the permit or other types of advocacy for other causes. I think that the tension is always there, and it's one of the most frustrating things in our work. On the one hand, we're, holding this or acknowledging and recognizing the importance of the immediate needs of the people that we are in contact with them and in touch with them on a daily basis. And on the other hand, we also see how the fact that the international community and various communities and audiences prefer to avoid addressing the structural reasons of the situation that we have today, whether in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank or in historic Palestine in general. We see how this also, maybe I would say that it delays, reaching a political, I would say resolution where there is no siege on the Gaza Strip and where Palestinians have sovereignty, where they have autonomy, and then where they can also, build and develop their own health systems and, other structures and systems. Yet we do acknowledge that sometimes there is some hope in advocating for individuals or advocating for specific things without necessarily addressing the structures, of the occupation or the political situation. I wouldn't say that it is necessarily also sustainable, because I do believe, and this is one of the things that I advocate for also within the organization, and whenever I speak about this, is that from my experience, when we don't address the structural root causes, we can't expect that there's gonna be, a profound change in the reality of Palestinians. So we can choose to continue doing this because we can help individuals in a certain point of time when they need, for example, a medical permit. And I do think that there is a difference between mental health services, because this is something that people need, whether they live under occupation or a civil war or other types of, difficult realities, or for example, humanitarian assistance, capacity buildings in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, and providing medical care and helping with the permit regime. I do think that these are different things. I don't know, I think that people would hope to hear that, yeah, we can hold both of them and we can do both of them. But from my experience and our experience in Physicians for Human Rights, and we've been doing the humanitarian assistance for decades now, it can help in the short term. But if we look retrospectively, then we can see that there's only a deterioration, not only in the political, landscape, but also in terms of the health of Palestinians, and when it comes to the rates of people who obtain the permit or delayed the permit. So I think this tension is always there, and I think it's one of the most difficult things is to try to hold these two and to choose sometimes to avoid addressing the root causes So you can mobilize several community to voice their opposition to specific policies where they have impact on the health of Palestinians. But for example, they won't be ready or willing to speak of the larger context of the political situation. So I think sometimes it's a strategy that we can follow, but it has also cons as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, recognizing the good work PHRI does for individuals, and also recognizing that this is not a tension that we can fully adjudicate in an hour and a half webinar. This is something that I think everyone on this call and in this field wrestles with regularly, and I think will continue to do so. And, liberation requires a lot of efforts. It's a large ecosystem of actors. And so I think these conversations have a role to play in what that ultimately looks like. Thank you so much, Ghada, Razzan, and Yasser for today's conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us or listened to this event. I feel so grateful to be able to share this conversation with you. I feel like I could keep going for another hour or so. I know I wasn't able to get to everyone's questions, but hopefully some will be answered in the follow-up email and the resources we share after the fact. Please check back at the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for a list of resources relating to the conversation we just had and for announcements of upcoming events, webinars, podcasts on this and other multitude of topics. Thank you all for joining, and until next time.